I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about a new direction that CSIS has taken and a very new and important person here at CSIS, we have with us Navin Gurushankar, who is president of our new Economic Security and Technology Department here at CSIS. Navin just started this week, so it's really exciting to have him on Truth of the Matter. We got a lot to talk about, don't we?
Andrew, I'm delighted to be here. We do. And I've been a fan of your podcast when I was outside CSIS, and I'm glad to be in the room with you here.
Well, let's talk about that. Navin was a senior official at the Commerce Department. Tell me what you were doing before you came here.
Yeah, I was really fortunate in my last job to be the senior counselor for Deputy Secretary Graves and for Secretary Raimondo. I covered both domestic and international issues. On the domestic front, I was centrally involved in industrial strategy investments across chips, broadband, tech hubs, Recompete. My focus for the DepSec was developing a framework on place-based economic development to drive those investments. On the international front, I'll tell you a little bit more about my background with the World Bank and Bridgewater Associates, but the Secretary and DepSec had me working on a number of countries, in particular Africa, as well as our partnerships in Asia and Eastern Europe. I led the Commerce Department's first department-wide strategy on Africa, which is really to drive U.S.-Africa commercial and trade relationships around critical and emerging technologies. And similarly, I was engaged in the Indo-Pacific around the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and our bilateral relationships around the world. So it was kind of a broad template. For me, it was an absolute thrill to serve in that capacity, using my experience in different ways. And, I think my main takeaway is that we're at a really unique moment in U.S. economic policy, and a lot of the center of gravity had shifted to the Commerce Department for reasons that we can talk about. But, what a thrill for me after many years in different parts of the world and different sectors to land there and serve my country.
Yeah, I mean, you came before your service in government. You worked at the World Bank. You worked with Ray Dalio at Bridgewater Associates. How did that help inform what you went on to do in government and what you're doing here now at CSIS, which we're going to get into?
Well, I spent 20 years at the World Bank working on a number of different issues. I'd broadly say it was economic research and evaluation, raising money for the World Bank, including for its fund for lower income countries, as well as innovative finance mechanisms to raise money, mobilizing private capital. And the third being in country. I lived in Africa for a while. I worked in a number of other countries around the world, Indo-Pacific, Eastern Europe, Caribbean. When I connect the dots across that set of experiences, it's really trying to do two things, which is understand what are the drivers of economic growth in countries, of prosperity, and then using tools combining policy design and finance and sovereign lending and sub-sovereign lending to generate outcomes on the ground for countries, and with a heavy accent on the contributions of the private sector. After a long career there, the thing that I found most exciting, even after 20 years, was to go and try and address those issues from a different perspective, working at Bridgewater. As you know, Ray, Bob Prince, Greg Jensen, that whole crew of people at Bridgewater are phenomenal in developing frameworks for understanding how markets and economies work. I was thrilled to learn that from a different perspective, and importantly, to understand how markets work and how, the biggest pools of capital allocate money around the world. And that's a discipline. Thinking through the world from that perspective is a different way of thinking about the world than if you were sitting and advising a government.
Sure.
And it's actually connecting the dots between the two and coming to a synthesis and weighing the challenges of both that enriches your perspective. And that's what I brought to the Commerce Department. And therefore, that's what I hope to bring to CSIS.
Well, let's talk about that. So CSIS announced big changes this week with the creation of an economic security and technology department and your appointment as its new president. This is a nascent effort with CSIS. Tell us more about what we're trying to do with this and why.
Yeah. So first, what it is a department that combines 11 programs and special projects that cut across the following areas. Programs and projects that have expertise and researchers with expertise on economic tools, everything from trade to investment policy, investment screening, export controls, industrial strategy, commercial diplomacy, the full toolkit of economic statecraft. Programs that have deep technology experience, AI, quantum, cyber, clean tech, and hopefully we'll have more. And programs that have expertise in understanding U.S. relationships with other countries, U.S.-China, U.S.-India, U.S. Across Europe and the global south. When you take this together, we have to develop a system where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in order to generate great insights about how the world is changing and great ideas about how to fashion policy so that it generates the outcomes that we want. And so let me tell you what the goal of the department is when we do that. It's to really ensure that U.S. and U.S. allies maintain and grow their technology advantage to address three really big challenges: long-term productivity, long-term prosperity and growth. Second, the ability to counter adversaries that are threatening democratic norms and market economies. And then thirdly, to be able to get ahead of major global challenges, including climate change and pandemics. Our ability to do these big things depends on maintaining and growing our tech advantage. And that means innovating, but also being cognizant of national security threats that undermine our ability to innovate. And so that's what this department is really about. Let me step back and say one more thing, which is that when I came here, I was so thrilled to be able to come to CSIS. I've been an admirer for many years, been in this town, in and out of this town for 30 years. And CSIS has a 6-decade history in shaping national security policy for the U.S. It plays a pivotal role for our country. But as circumstances change and as challenges change, our approach to national security has to change. And so everything I've described is about a really important step in the evolution of CSIS to be fit for purpose for the 21st century.
So Navin, we're talking about economic security because it is national security, and we're really defining that here at CSIS. Can you tell me and our listeners what we really mean by that?
Yeah, Andrew, I think that the simplest way I can describe this is that we're in the midst of a high-stakes, must-win global technology competition with our adversaries. Our ability to win that competition across a number of technologies requires that we have the incentives to out-innovate, but we also have the guardrails around national security threats. And specifically, there are different types. There are examples of rampant IP theft of ideas that our entrepreneurs generate. There are unfair trade practices that undermine our companies and hurt our companies. There are efforts by our adversaries to use the instruments of the state and industrial policies to play the long game, to actually subsidize significantly what they're producing at home and how they build relationships with partners that we have had historically around the world, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, Africa, or Latin America. And so when you think about these and you think about the fact that those adversaries, including the PRC, are undertaking efforts in technologies where there's civil-military fusion. These are dual-use technologies that can be used to directly undermine our national security. It would be foolish for us to pretend that we're in a world that is laissez-faire and globalized and it's simply just about the market. In fact, it's naive. They've played the long game and we're catching up. And so it's imperative that we take a hard-nosed look at our technology capabilities relative to theirs, our vulnerabilities relative to theirs. We look through that lens of different technologies, what impact they can have on the economy, what impact they can have on our ability to generate long-term prosperity for our people and for allies, as well as protect against very real threats to our democracy and how our democracies function. So that's in a nutshell how I see it. And so what does that mean for people, for policymakers in Washington? What does that mean for the private sector?
And this really goes to your vision for what the department's going to be too, right?
Yes. So this is wet clay. But I'll tell you what we need to do, and I feel like this is what I would say is success going forward. So what we need to do is we need to strengthen our analytical capabilities, including our approach to economic analysis and how that applies to technology areas. We need to think through what public and private sector collaboration looks like, because the private sector is not simply a consumer of CSIS analysis. I think it needs to be in there, a thought leader, a thought partner with CSIS, because so much of tech competition depends on the viability of these ideas for the private sector. We rely on them to generate good ideas, innovation, and new technologies. The other thing we'll need to do, I believe, is to really think about what this toolkit is, how these tools work together or don't work together, and what are the instruments of economic statecraft for the United States and its allies to achieve the goals they're trying to achieve in this area.
Can you give me an example of the toolkit? What are some of the things that you're going to be looking at, the department's going to be looking at, and some of the kinds of, policy recommendations that we're going to want to highlight for, members of Congress and the administration?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple that stand out. So there's a lot of work that we've done, CSIS has done, and will continue to do on export controls, trade restrictions, including on advanced technologies. For me, I think that many of the colleagues I've spoken to here share an interest in looking at the impact of export controls. Are they working? How can they work more effectively? Both at blunting the advance of technology absorption, say by adversaries that are using them for dual use, meaning civil military fusion. But what are the economic impacts on the private sector here in the US? That's an interesting area that we should be going into. Importantly, how do you marry that with efforts to invest in our technology and industrial base here in the United States? So chips and clean tech, biotech, other areas, quantum, AI. And so how do these balance with each other? On the one hand, you're blunting the advance where the risks are great, that those technologies can get into the wrong hands for the wrong purposes. At the same time, you can't just, as my colleague Jim Lewis says, just stand on the brake. You have to out-innovate. What are the incentives? What are the mechanisms? What are the tools to accelerate that innovation?
Right, because the only thing that keeps us moving forward and keeping us further from the pack is our innovation, correct?
100%. That's the long arc of American history. And we can't lose that thread. What's timeless and universal about what's led to the growth of the U.S. economy, not over 10 years or 20 years, but over 200 years? And how do we not lose that, even though we're dealing with these national security threats that undermine the very principles that allow us to do that? Let me just add another. We were recently at the Innovative Capital Summit that Secretary Raimondo and Deputy Secretary Graves and Dr. Panchanathan, director of NSF, had launched with the capital providers. That is about investing in technology clusters all across the United States, marrying local government, federal government, private industry, universities, the American investment community. It's a whole new approach to economic governance. It's a bet, but the bet is that there are latent capabilities. There's American genius, not just in Silicon Valley and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in New York City, but that genius is latent and everywhere. In many cases, it's not latent. Obviously, Texas and the South and the Heartland, the Midwest. But that's not just going to be unleashed by itself. It needs an approach to policy that's not purely around, at least this is what the policy has been, not purely around a laissez-faire approach to let the market work, but it may require additional assistance, particularly in light of what our adversaries are doing. So that's the context. I think that's where we need to reposition and ask good questions. And there are really good questions, just so you're aware. Is it working? How do we support course corrections in a system that is a boisterous democracy like ours? And how do we bring really good analysis to make sense of how a particular tech hub is evolving relative to what competitors are doing around the world and relative to what private sector companies could be doing elsewhere? So these are the types of questions we should be asking. But you can't answer this question, Andrew, if you just look at one piece of the puzzle. You can't just look at the export control piece and answer the larger question. You can't just look at strategic investments and answer the question. You can't just look at, is investment screening working to keep adversarial capital out of these clusters, and not look at where is replacement capital coming from, right? And so this is not easy, and it's not easy to communicate to the public, but we have to do a much better job of doing that, not because we're not doing a good job, but because the bar is higher than it's ever been.
Navin, tell us a little bit, you're new to CSIS and your capabilities are also new to CSIS. What are your particular research interests?
Well, I'm interested in everything the team is doing, but my particular couple areas that I'm very excited about is what the investment community is doing in response to the opportunities that industrial strategy is creating. So much of it, whether what we're doing in chips or in these other areas we mentioned, hinges on private industry and American investors investing. And I think from what I've observed, I've been very impressed with the thinking, for example, Secretary Raimondo's work around chips. But I would say that we need to do a better job of understanding what investors are looking for. Like, you can't exhort people to invest. It's not that. It's like they have to make judgments about risk and return, and does it make sense relative to investing in other parts of the world or in other sectors. And this is a sophisticated conversation. And, I would love to understand what's happening in real time better. It's not just American investors, it's investors around the world. What I find really interesting at the recent Select USA Summit is telling the story and understanding how foreign direct investment from countries like Korea in the United States in areas like EVs or in chips or in clean tech, other parts of clean tech, where are those investments going? Are they going to South Carolina? Are they going to Texas? Are they going to the Midwest? Whether that's working or not is something we should be paying attention to. So I'm interested in that set of topics. The second thing I have an interest in is, frankly, it's a question I have, which is it enough to make strategic public investments without a trade policy and without a way back to trade? Because ultimately, these investments will need to be subject to a market test. And so the ROI of any particular investment is really dependent on whether the companies that we invest in are competitive. And so I think there's a perspective here that needs to be developed. Something like, what are trusted and safe technology ecosystems in the US and with allies, within which you can have fierce competition, but around which you have guardrails around the national security threats that we all face together. So the export controls or the protections for IP and so on and so forth. So these are two things that I think are quite important. In fact, quite inspired by what I was working on at the Commerce Department around these topics.
Navin, I've heard you talk about economic geography. What does that actually mean?
Well, I think place matters. When you look at how firms develop or economic clusters develop, the topography of an economy is not uniform. You have like a cluster in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the cluster right here outside of DC in the Northern Virginia. We know for a long time we've studied how agglomeration works, meaning how firm density and industries develop within certain locations and how firms connect to those. And so when you look at value chains, you have to think of it from the perspective of how these clusters are also developing as nodes of trade and investment. Now, here's the question, and this is an open question. I would say that our country, the history of it has been for these things to develop organically, not purely organically, but there's a good deal of it evolving in response to the market and, with some public policy. You have other countries where they've taken a very top-down approach to it, like the special economic zone approach. I would say it's managed. I wouldn't say top-down, it's managed. We're making a bet now of finding a way in which government with business and local communities are making bets on places. That's what the Tech Hubs agenda is. That's what Build Back Better Regional Challenge is. And I think it's valuable because if you just left it to the market, you might find that you're leaving money on the table in the sense that the opportunity for agglomeration, the opportunity for more firm density, the opportunity for cluster development has fallen by the wayside because you actually need to fashion things like supportive infrastructure and workforce development and connection to universities and training of small and medium-sized enterprises so they could take advantage of these opportunities. All of this doesn't just happen on its own. I mean, it happens on its own, but it happens by people working together. And they happen to sit at they come with different tools and they sit in different sectors. But it's that coordination that I think has always happened, but can it happen in a more intelligent way? I think that's the bet that at least the Biden administration has made. And it's worth an institution like CSIS taking a hard-nosed look and saying, is it working?
So tell us more about public-private collaboration and how you see CSIS's role.
Yeah, so like I just gave you this example of tech hubs or clusters.
Yeah.
It's emblematic of what's happening across the country, and I think what has to happen here in Washington with institutions like ours. Actually, CSIS and many of our programs have already been doing it for a long time, but I think we may need to do it in a more systematic way, at least as we build this department.
In a more strategic way.
Yeah. So, for example, I talked to you about a deep partnership with the investment community and the private sector. My perspective, having spent some time, with companies like Bridgewater, is that there are a lot of people with really great insights. And I think of the next-gen investors who are really hard at it to try and understand how economies work, where money is flowing, what's happening with policy and how it flows through to money and credit and all that kind of stuff. And that is a very, very powerful perspective across a number of asset managers in the US, across institutional allocators. If we could bring that perspective into policy, that would be really valuable for government folks to hear about, right? Not that they're not talking to them, but I mean, do it in a way in which the insights of that type of thinking could be brought to bear in terms of its policy implications. Similarly, private industry. And so I'd like to see if we can do this not as one-offs, not as an event here, not as a specific fellowship here, but systematically as a set of strategic kind of partnerships or efforts around bringing those insights. And it has implications. Let me just add one thing here is that I've always felt that if you look at industrial strategy that the administration is implementing, it would really be powerful if the U.S. government had an understanding of how capital flows are working. I'm not saying that we don't have it, but I felt that there were some gaps where that information would be valuable. Not only capital within the U.S., but globally, right? Because so much of the success of it depends on understanding what capital is looking for. And so it's that intelligent approach to industrial policy that I think would be valuable in Washington.
And how do you think policymakers should be engaging the public on this? And how can we help them better engage the public on this?
Well, this is actually something that I'm seeking your advice on because you've been at the coalface of this for a long time. But
I see a lot of podcasts in our future.
Yeah. But let me tell you something, and I want to learn a lot from you on this. I'll tell you what I can say, and this is just a reflection. Folks who've been in the weeds of these things tend to overtalk and try to, drink the whole ocean in one in one gulp. And it's really hard for people who are not in it to understand it, even like among policy people.
It's a big gulp.
And it's really hard for folks outside to say, look, what are you doing? Like, make it simple. There's some gifted communicators in this country. And I would love to see if they could help us explain this in very, very simple terms. I think we need to do two things. have a really hard-nosed assessment of what is happening on the ground economically, technologically. What are real opportunities that are evolving? What are real threats? So not like, get on any YouTube video and say what you want. Like, what's real? That's what CSIS has the capability to do. And two, find a way to speak about that and hard truths in a very simple way, so that the question is, am I going to have the same canvas I can paint on, maybe an even bigger canvas as a young person today than my parents did? That's what it comes down to. Let's boil it down to the simple thing. And that's kind of what we should be holding ourselves accountable to when we do this work, and when government does that work, and when government, private sector do that work together.
Navin, I can't wait to see all the great things you're going to be doing here, and I can't wait to share some of this research and insight with our listeners. So thank you so much for being here today, and I look forward to a lot of great collaboration with you going forward.
Well, thank you, brother. We're going to do it together, you and me and everyone else here. So I appreciate you, and thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm a big fan of all of these, so thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.